Welcome to the webinar series of the Homiletical Theology Project. My name is David Schnese-Jacobson. I'm Professor of Preaching here at Boston University School of Theology and Director of the Homiletical Theology Project. Today I'm presenting on the topic of what is homiletical theology as a way of framing up our webinar series this spring. Homiletical theology is not a new term. However, it is a concept still being defined in the field of homiletics. A number of contemporary homileticians talk about homiletical theology. Few, however, have defined its scope. The term homiletical theology actually shows up after the Reformation. Scholastic theologians like the Dutch Reformed Vitringa and the German Lutheran Quenstedt used the term homiletical theology to talk about a unified vision of theology that extended even to the sermon. That unified sense of theology, however, is precisely part of what breaks down after the Enlightenment. With it, the idea of homiletical theology ends up being viewed as something less. In some contemporary literature, merely the realm of application. Not so much theology, but sermon technique. In his book, Homiletics, Karl Barth takes on this Enlightenment view of homiletics and theology. Barth argues that all theology is sermon preparation. Barth's vision is to see theology at the service of preaching, and not the other way around. In some ways, Barth's vision has inspired today's homiletical theologians, people like Paul Wilson and Luke Powery. Both Wilson and Powery embrace a Barthian dialectical theology in preaching. With Wilson, trouble and grace, cross and resurrection. With Powery, lament and celebration, death and hope. In this sense, says Wilson, homiletical theology is the completion of theology. Just as Barth gives up on systematic theology in favor of a dogmatic theology that focuses on the gospel, Wilson, and to some degree Powery, envision a homiletical theology in a dogmatic mode, focused on the kerygma, on the dialectics of the gospel. But the dogmatic mode of homiletical theology is not the only one available today. Some homileticians have argued that homiletical theology is better understood as a form of practical theology. This vision of practical theology can take at least two forms among homiletical theologians. Princeton's Charles Bartow argued that homiletical theology is a form of criticism that leads to a revised preaching practice. He begins with the practices of preaching, uses theoretical tools like performance theory and rhetoric in order to refine it, and then norms that practice within a theological frame. For Bartow, homiletical theology is a form of criticism that can be used pedagogically, for analyzing classroom sermons, professionally for revising one's own preaching practice, and in a scholarly way by undertaking critical research in order to uncover implications for preaching theory from a rigorous study of what Bartow calls exemplary practice. Bartow's model of homiletical theology is a practical theological one in terms of method. It is about doing homiletical theology from practice to theory and to practice again. However, this is not the only way of understanding homiletical theology within a practical theological vision. Michael Pasquarello uses the language of homiletical theology to describe preaching as a theological practice. With Michael Pasquarello's work, homiletical theology as practical theology takes a turn toward wisdom. Following the work of theologian Ed Farley, Pasquarello views homiletical theology as a kind of habitus, a Latin term for wisdom, born of preaching practice. Homiletical theology for him is not something one does as a matter of method at all. Instead, homiletical theology is a habitus, a wisdom imparted in the practice of preaching itself. In recent years, however, this phrase, homiletical theology, has been coming up in other ways too. Yet the vision here is neither a dogmatic one nor a strictly practical theological one. Its model for homiletical theology is rather constructive theology. Constructive theology emerges at a time when theologians sense the difficulty of writing systematic theologies. In an age of suspicion, where authority has been problematized and the foundations are shaking, it is difficult to think of theology systematically at all. Constructive theology then begins with the tradition and all the standard loci of theology, and seeks to retrieve elements of that tradition while constructing something new. Some homileticians, and I place my own work right here, view homiletical theology as a form of constructive theology. This vision of homiletical theology begins, to my mind, with the work of David Buttrick. In Buttrick's foreword to Barth's homiletics, Buttrick turns Barth's famous dictum upside down. Barth, you'll recall, argued that all theology is sermon preparation. Buttrick suggests that the opposite is true. All sermon preparation, he says, is theology. This way of thinking about preaching is not just as the completion of theology, but as its constructive venue has proved a fruitful one. In Buttrick's early work, Preaching Jesus Christ, a Homiletic Theology, David Buttrick actually does theology as a homiletician. The idea continues for Buttrick in his later work. Books like Speaking Jesus and Speaking Conflict embody this idea. Homiletical theology is the doing of constructive theology. In these latter works, Buttrick says, homiletic theology includes how to think through a biblical text, how to order one's thoughts homiletically, grasp the salient critical issues with theological wisdom, and then, quote, in a collision course with the cultural mind, ultimately think out rhetorical strategies in preaching, theologically. In this sense, it represents a vision consistent with his inversion of Barth, where all sermon preparation is theology. Other homileticians have tried to develop homiletical theology in similar constructive ways. In one article, Susan Hedall uses the term to describe the need for, quote, constructing homiletical meaning-making somewhere beyond classical models of authority. In another article, homiletician Teresa Strickland makes a case for homiletical theology as a unique theological method. Ultimately, its character must be a critical one, Strickland argues, that accounts for the corruptions of human speech, even while it struggles to name the gospel using, quote, images, metaphors, symbols, narratives, and thoughtful reflections. This is Strickland's critical constructive vision of homiletical theology as method. I place my own work in Kairos preaching in the same constructive vision for homiletical theology. For me, homiletical theology is a constructive task because it concerns itself with relating an understanding of the gospel to a situation in context. The gospel may well begin that conversation with culture, but culture does more than listen. It engages the homiletical theologian, sometimes even enlarging the homiletical theologian's own vision. In this way, homiletical theology is truly a constructive task. So, what is homiletical theology? Is it the sermonic completion of dogmatic theology? Is it a special kind of practical theology, either in terms of method or practical wisdom? Or is homiletical theology rather a form of constructive theology? It's probably a mistake to assume that we have to make a choice. In truth, homiletical theology takes on all of these forms, and sometimes combines them. Perhaps it's best then to chart out places where homiletical theology actually operates. At the Homiletical Theology Project website, I've identified 5 intersections where homiletical theology typically does its work. Theologies of preaching, theologies of the gospel, theologies of word and sacrament, the use of theology in sermons, and preaching itself as theological method. We've noticed that several of these intersections were mentioned as I discovered and uncovered the different visions for homiletical theology. I would like to use this occasion to invite others to explore these intersections more deeply for our common task as homiletical theologians. I hope you will join me in elaborating what homiletical theology is and envisioning what homiletical theology can be. Welcome to the Homiletical Theology Project.